Imagine stepping out of your warm, cozy room right now, where the hum of an AC or heater lulls you into forgetting how fragile comfort really is, and being thrust into a world where the air itself feels like it wants you dead, where the very act of breathing cuts your lungs like broken glass, and even your own sweat becomes an enemy that can finish you off in minutes. Welcome to the American frontier in the late 1800s, a place where winter was not a season, but a predator, always waiting for one mistake, one miscalculation, one unlucky turn to snuff out lives. And yet somehow ordinary men, women, and children endured it. They fought back not with modern insulation or endless convenience, but with grit, desperation, and tricks learned the hard way, or borrowed from those who had already mastered this hostile land. And before you scoff at their struggle, thinking you know cold, let's be brutally honest, you don't, not in the way they did, because here's the truth. They woke up every morning with frost inside their homes, eyelashes frozen shut, quilts stiff with ice, and the haunting knowledge that if they ran out of fuel, if their food spoiled, if their fire went out in the night, their bodies would be found stiff and silent come morning. And as you listen to this story, yes, you, right now, sitting comfortable, you're about to follow them through a frozen gauntlet of survival, where mistakes cost fingers, toes, sometimes lives, and where ingenuity was the only currency that mattered. Think about the Dakota Territory in 1885. A child cracks open frozen eyelids and feels her tears freeze mid-fall. A family huddles together with chickens and dogs just to add one more layer of warmth. And outside, the prairie wind is screaming, bending wood, scouring skin raw. Yet still they rise and face the day, because they have no choice. Survival wasn't romantic, it was relentless, and every breath carried the possibility it could be the last if the elements won. Preparation was their first and fiercest weapon. Every autumn was a countdown clock to the killing frost, and families worked from dawn till dusk, sealing cracks in cabins with rags, hauling in corn husks, slaughtering animals for winter stores, stacking mountains of buffalo chips, yes, dried bison dung, the fuel of last resort and first defense, because without it, fires would die, and so would the families. And don't laugh, because if you were out there, you'd be on your knees too, grateful for the stinkless, fiber-rich heat of animal waste. Disgusting becomes sacred when survival is on the line. Some learned the hard way, like the Jensens from Philadelphia, who thought their neat eastern clapboard house with windows and charm could stand against prairie storms. It didn't. It turned into an icebox coffin where food spoiled, water froze, and meals became boiled leather, until a Lakota elder, with a mixture of pity and sharp observation, showed them what real survival looked like. Repositioning doors away from wind, building berms, creating windbreaks, and in a single gesture, shattering their arrogance that civilization knew better than centuries of lived wisdom. The settlers who adapted thrived, or at least survived. The ones who clung to their eastern pride often died with it. Consider the sod house, the so-called soddy, the ugly dirt brick hut that eastern newcomers sneered at until they realized those 3-foot-thick earthen walls mocked the cold, trapping warmth like primitive insulation, holding steady at 50 degrees when outside it was 30 below, and inside, yes, it dripped mud, bugs wriggled, snakes slithered, and water ran through the roof during thaws. But you tell me, would you rather scratch fleas or bury your children in a frozen graveyard? Families like the Williams thrived in sod homes, pulling chickens into bed and walling themselves with quilts to partition warmth, even orienting doors south for the faint kiss of sunlight, proving that survival was about pragmatism, not pride. And even then, the fight was endless, banking fires at night to keep coals smoldering, rationing buffalo chips like gold coins, teaching children that 3 chips was breakfast, 2 at midday, 4 at night. No exceptions, no whining, because a wasted chip could mean a lost life. They burned everything when it ran out. Tables, chairs, cradles that once rocked babies, books that once stirred souls. And while you clutch your phone or sip your coffee, remember that back then, every object was weighed against the worth of another hour of heat, another breath spared from freezing lungs. And yet, as desperate as it was, the frontier was also a brutal teacher of ingenuity. Stones heated in fires and tucked into beds became primitive hot water bottles. Moccasins lined with rabbit fur kept toes alive where Boston boots killed them, and children learned before they could write that mittens saved fingers while gloves sacrificed them to frostbite. And yes, I'm breaking the fourth wall here because you need to picture it. Your designer hoodie, your cotton pajamas, your stylish sneakers, all of them death sentences out there, cotton especially, the killer fabric that drained body heat when damp and turned proud settlers into statues, frozen mid-step with axes still on their shoulders. Wool, fur, leather, layers that was survival's armor, not fashion, and the ones who sneered at savage clothes often died wrapped in their civility. And still, storms came that mocked preparation, like the children's blizzard of 1888, when warm morning skies tricked kids into walking to school in light jackets before a sudden roar of wind turned noon into a howling black wall of snow, and 235 lives vanished, many of them children frozen yards from safety, and only those led by quick thinkers like Minnie Freeman, who tied her students together with rope and marched them through blindness, survived to tell the tale. Every winter brought these tests, and every survivor carried scars, lost fingers, ruined feet, memories of neighbors never found until thaw, and the endless gnawing fear of fuel piles shrinking too fast. Communities learned to fight back together, tearing down weaker houses to feed stronger ones, cramming 3 families into one soddy until privacy meant nothing, rationing hay knots twisted by bleeding hands, and sharing food so thin it was barely survival, but survival nonetheless. And if you think that sounds miserable, you're right, but here's the uncomfortable truth. It worked. They endured. They bent but did not break, and in doing so, they left us lessons we've almost entirely forgotten in our climate-controlled cocoons, that survival depends on humility, on abandoning pride, on learning from those who know better, and on adapting faster than nature can kill you. Because the frontier didn't just test your body, it tested your willingness to change, to admit you were wrong, to burn what you once thought sacred, to dress like those you mocked, to gather dung with reverence, to huddle with chickens if that's what kept a child alive, and above all, to never waste warmth, breath, or hope. The prairie cold did not negotiate, it simply waited, creeping into bones, into walls, into the human will itself. And the ones who lasted were the ones who built not just houses, but entire systems of survival, where every decision mattered, every object had its place, every mistake carried consequences you couldn't afford. Because winter wasn't a backdrop, it was the main character of frontier life, and it was merciless. Settlers learned that the pretty houses they had imagined from back east, the neat wooden frames with bright windows, were nothing more than coffins with curtains when January winds tore across Dakota, so they abandoned notions of elegance and embraced dirt walls, berms, airlock entries, and animal heat bleeding through shared walls, a cow's body warmth keeping children from freezing in their sleep. And yes, it was disgusting, it smelled, it was undignified, but would you really rather smell manure than bury your family under frozen ground? Because those were the choices. And don't shake your head as if you wouldn't do the same when the mercury plummeted past comprehension. The survivors even learned from every disaster, turning trauma into design lessons, chimneys clogged with snow and blizzards, suffocating families in smoke, led to improvised ventilation systems, cut high into sod walls so air could still flow when doors were snowed in, and after storms like the infamous White Death, families dug tunnels connecting house to barn so animals could be tended without ever stepping into the killing white void, because venturing even 30 yards into a blizzard was often the same as suicide. Imagine Robert Miller tied to a rope, dragging himself through chest-deep snow, only to have the rope snap, leaving him blind and untethered in a screaming white world, his only hope to stumble onto something solid, and by sheer grit he found his barn and dug his way back to his home, frostbitten but alive. And you can almost feel his wife's tears when she saw him return, like an ice creature breaking through a tomb, because she had already imagined herself widowed with starving children. That was frontier logic. Lose 3 toes, keep your life, call it victory. And through it all, heat remained the most precious currency. Every family obsessed over it, calculated it, measured it out like misers counting coins. Buffalo chips stacked in piles, prairie grass twisted into knots until hands bled, corn cobs bundled, hay pressed into blocks, even manure mixed and sun-dried into fuel bricks that burned longer than plain dung, all of it scraped together and burned piece by piece. Rationed with almost religious precision, 3 chips for breakfast, 2 for midday, 4 for supper, no exceptions, because fire wasn't comfort, it was survival itself, and the potbelly stove became the black iron heart of every home, radiating not just warmth, but the fragile reassurance that life would stretch one day further. And yet fire was also a threat, a treacherous ally. Chimneys clogged and killed silently with carbon monoxide, stoves malfunctioned, creosote ignited into blazing death, and families sometimes never woke from sleep, poisoned by the very thing meant to save them. So neighbors checked chimneys for smoke each morning, and clever settlers kept canaries or mice in cages to warn them of invisible poison long before science named it. You sitting there now, warm, safe, probably scrolling or listening half distracted, can you even grasp what it means to burn your cradle, your books, your furniture, to feed flames, not because you wanted to, but because you had no choice, because it was burn wood or burn flesh? Sarah Miller did. She wrote with bitter heartbreak about burning the cradle that had held every one of her babies, saying through tears it was better to burn it than bury a child, and that kind of brutal arithmetic was winter's constant demand. And yet, even in this misery, the frontier whispered lessons we've mostly forgotten, that survival isn't about strength or pride, but about adaptability, humility, and yes, community. Because when the hard winter of 1880-81 hit, families realized that no matter how much dung they stacked, how many walls they thickened, they would not last alone, so entire settlements chose survival over pride, cramming 3 families into one house, dismantling 16 others for fuel, sacrificing years of labor to feed stoves, and living packed shoulder to shoulder in dark, reeking rooms where privacy disappeared, but warmth clung stubbornly to flesh. Ingrid Len remembered how 17 people lived in the Wallace house, children sleeping under tables and on shelves, adults taking shifts for floor space. And she wrote how Mrs. Anderson cried as her front door was torn from its hinges to be burned, but still she agreed, because better a door sacrificed than a coffin built. Pride had no place when survival demanded humility. Think about that, because it matters even now how quickly property, privacy, civility itself vanish when the air outside is trying to kill you. And if you think this is all exaggerated, think again, because diaries, journals, and survivor testimonies all speak with one voice. The prairie cold was not something you got used to. It was something you fought every single day and often lost, and clothing was the front line of that battle. Not style, not elegance, not even comfort, but armor layers of wool trapping heat, even when wet, leather softened with tallow to block the slicing wind, fur mittens binding fingers together in shared warmth, moccasins lined with rabbit skin, saving toes where polished boots froze them black, and always the strictest rules: never cotton, never sweat left to dry against skin, never trust fine Eastern garments that looked civilized but killed efficiently. Margaret Wilson's husband learned that with frozen arms that cost him fingers, while others, like John Hamilton, swallowed their pride after nearly dying in a Vermont wool coat that Dakota winds laughed at, finally asking Lakota neighbors for help, who showed him how survival wasn't about thick coats, but about layered systems, loose outer garments trapping air, scarves wrapped to protect nostrils without freezing breath into ice masks, every layer designed not for looks but for endurance, and those who adapted lived, while those who sneered at savage clothes often didn't see spring. And let's not romanticize. It was ugly, smelly, undignified, sometimes humiliating, but it was alive, and alive was always enough. Do you get it yet? That you, in your soft cotton hoodie, would last maybe an hour out there before hypothermia dragged you down, while a woman dressed in raccoon hat, with tail still swinging, and rabbit skin leggings under skirts, might last all day? That's the lesson they learned to wear death's uniform and laugh back at the blizzard. And then came travel, the deadliest necessity, because no matter how well stocked, eventually someone had to go out, to tend animals, to fetch supplies, to cut wood, and that was when the real gamble began, because the prairie loved to play tricks, offering a mild morning before collapsing the sky into a whiteout by noon, turning a short trip into a death march, and families knew the odds. Men who left wagons in storms froze within yards. Men who stayed sometimes survived, but no choice was without risk. Charles Wallace's story proves it. He prepared with wool, fur, food, blankets, even a hook stick to probe for trails, but still the storm swallowed him. His horse bolted, his wagon stuck, and he had to choose between waiting in a death trap or walking blind. He chose to walk, counting steps, muttering prayers, recognizing confusion as hypothermia's whisper, digging a snow cave by a creek bank with trembling hands, forcing himself awake through the night, and somehow, unbelievably, surviving until morning, when he staggered to town, looking like a corpse come to life, beard and brows solid with ice, face swollen raw, but alive. And here's where I break the fourth wall again, because you need to hear this the way they meant it. Charles himself told newcomers to dress as if you'll be sleeping in a snowbank, because you might, and that wasn't a metaphor, it was literal survival instruction. These lessons became oral traditions, passed in barns and churches, not for pride, but for survival. And if you think you could handle it, imagine this: your spit freezing before it hits the ground, your boots hard as wood if left outside overnight, your children coughing in the dark with frost on their blankets, while you wonder if you have enough dung left for one more night. That was life. That was winter. That was the frontier. And you're still not even halfway through the struggle. Food? Yes, the most obvious element of survival was in many ways the cruelest frontier winter challenge, because no matter how thick the sod walls, how hot the dung fire, or how many layers of fur they wore, without calories the body became its own worst enemy, burning muscle and fat until even warmth itself could not be maintained. And in a land without grocery stores or trains running regularly through blizzards, preparation meant everything. Entire harvest seasons became countdowns to winter's siege, where jars of dried apples, barrels of flour, salt pork, root vegetables in dirt cellars, and sacks of grain were not pantry items, but the difference between life and starvation, and families counted every portion against every day left until thaw, haunted by the knowledge that mold, rodents, or one bad storm could ruin supplies overnight. You listening right now might complain about your fridge being empty because you're out of snacks. Imagine instead staring at a half-empty barrel of cornmeal in February and knowing your children will be chewing boiled leather by March if no miracle arrives. Settlers preserved every edible thing, canning, salting, smoking, drying, and children as young as 5 were tasked with gathering, storing, sealing, and defending food supplies because mistakes were lethal. Communities sometimes pooled their reserves, trading potatoes for flour, dried meat for butter, but many winters saw families reduced to near nothing, meals of thin broth stretched with snow water, scraps of jerky rationed like jewels, or bread made from flour bulked with sawdust or ground grass seed just to fill stomachs. Diaries whisper of desperation, mothers boiling old bones 3-4 times to leach the last ghost of flavor into water, fathers setting traps for rabbits only to find snowdrifts empty, children chewing hardtack until gums bled, yet still grateful to have something to chew. And then there was the haunting specter of livestock, precious animals that meant spring survival, but also represented meat when starvation pressed too close. So families faced cruel decisions: slaughter the cow now and eat, but risk having no milk or no plow beast when spring came, or starve together and hope reserves hold. The balance was razor thin, and many gambled wrong. And if you think food was only about eating, you're missing the point. Calories were fire for the human furnace, and without them, no number of blankets or dung chips could save you. Fatigue set in, then confusion, then death, because hypothermia loves hunger as an accomplice. Survivors told of watching neighbors grow listless, speech slurred, eyes vacant, as cold and hunger teamed up to extinguish their lives. And yet, even here, ingenuity found cracks of light. Some learned to bury root cellars deep, insulated with straw and snow. Others copied indigenous techniques, drying meat into pemmican mixed with berries and fat, creating dense survival food that lasted months. Still others planned community food rotations, moving weaker families from home to home to spread out the burden of feeding mouths. These weren't luxuries, they were lifelines, and the prairie did not always reward them. Blizzards blocked trails, cutting off towns and what little trade existed. Railcars carrying flour or coal froze on tracks, sometimes yards away from desperate settlements that couldn't reach them through whiteout walls of snow. The result was winters remembered by names: the hard winter, the white death, because names helped soften the horror into story. But beneath the names lay families clawing through snowdrifts to find frozen carcasses of cattle, boiling shoes for leather broth, and crying over empty cellars while storms howled. And through all this, the settlers still rose each morning to relight stoves, clear frozen breath from bedding, haul water in buckets cracked by ice, tend shivering animals, and whisper to themselves that spring would come, though many never lived to see it. And here's where I look at you again, breaking the wall. You who complain when Wi-Fi drops for 10 minutes, who panic when the store runs out of your favorite cereal. Could you endure months of gnawing hunger, cold walls sweating with frost, endless work just to keep from dying? That's not an insult, it's a challenge, because the people who did endure were not superhuman. They were ordinary, terrified, often miserable souls who simply refused to give up, who burned their cradles, slaughtered their last chickens, sewed rabbit skins into mittens, and prayed into the black roar of blizzards that tomorrow would not be the day their fire went out for good. And finally, when the thaw came, when the first trickle of meltwater ran off roofs, when sod walls dripped mud, when weak sunlight touched the prairie again, those who survived emerged like ghosts, scarred, frostbitten, half-starved but alive. They buried their dead, rebuilt torn homes, restocked what little they had, and whispered hard-won lessons to newcomers. Never trust cotton, never underestimate the wind, always gather more fuel than you think you need, and above all, listen to the land, because pride kills faster than cold. And perhaps that's the truest hook of all. The frontier was not just about conquering wilderness, but about being humbled by it, stripped of illusions until only raw humanity remained. And out of that came resilience, innovation, and a legacy of survival that still echoes in the way we design our homes, the clothes we wear, the food we store, even if we've forgotten the origins. So here's the question I'll leave hanging in the frost-filled air for you. If tomorrow the heaters stopped, the grocery shelves emptied, and the world outside turned white with killing wind, would you remember these lessons? Would you adapt? Would you burn your cradle, wear your pride like fur, twist grass into fuel, and huddle with strangers just to see another dawn? Or would the cold claim you in a single night? Because out there on the prairie, only one truth mattered. Winter didn't care who you were, only whether you were ready to fight it, and those who failed to respect that truth never saw the spring.